Okay, so what's happening in chapter 4 of the Song of Songs, that's where we're up to, is it seems that we're still at the wedding scene. In other words, the end of chapter 3 mentioned the wedding, so we assume we're at the wedding scene, and within the wedding scene, we're talking. The man, is praising her, praising the woman, and he keeps praising her, and we mentioned some of that last week. And at the end of the verse, at the end of the chapter of chapter 4, the last verse, she begins to talk, and she sort of invites him to come to her garden, and we assume that's a metaphor for intimacy. And that's the end of chapter 4. And then we get to chapter 5. And chapter 5 is a tricky chapter because chapter 5, the second verse of chapter 5 is already distanced. And there's already a terrible distance, as we will see. But the first verse of chapter 5 is probably still, according to most opinions, it's still connected to the wedding. So whoever divided the chapters, which was not a Jewish source, it was divided by Christians. We just adapted that division for comfort, for ease, for convenience, is what I'm trying to say. It's probably not the right division. In other words, the first verse of chapter 5, which was what we're going to focus on today, should not be chapter 5, because chapter 5 is about the distance. But there may be another opinion which we'll try to get to. So what I want to do is I want to share the screen to the end, the last verse of chapter 4, and then we'll look at chapter 5, and we'll see what we can make of this and how the commentaries deal with this. So again, chapter 4, he's talking about her beauty, and we mentioned some of those verses last week. We focused on verse 4, and we also focused on the Baftani, verse 9. And he keeps going. He keeps going. How fair is your love, my sister, my bride. How much better is your love than wine, and the fragrance of your oils than all spices. He keeps praising her. Verse 12, a locked up garden is my sister, my bride, a locked up spring, a sealed fountain. Now, you keep in mind the word garden, because the word garden is going to come up again and again. So when he says, my sister, my bride is a locked garden, what does that mean? So the conventional interpretation is, it means that she is modest. In other words, he is praising her as being modest. Locked garden means she doesn't let anybody else, she doesn't have an intimate relationship with anybody else. That's part of her appeal to him. And then he keeps praising her. Your arid fields are as pomegranate orchard with sweet fruit, henna and spikenard, different spices. He keeps going, but he's using the metaphor of garden for intimacy. And then, so he's speaking the last 15 verses. Verse 16, we know for sure she is talking because of the form of the male and female, which I'll point that out. Awake, O north wind, and come, O south wind, blow upon my garden, that the spices thereof may flow out. Let my beloved come to his garden and eat his sweet fruit. So if he used the metaphor of a garden, of how we said earlier in verse 12, a locked up garden is my sister, my bride, a locked up spring, a sealed fountain. So now she says, when you have a garden, and he's using metaphors of fragrance and spices. So what happens is you can have all the spices in the world, but you need the wind to come and shake up the fruit, shake up the plants for them to give forth their fragrance. Right, in our driveway, we have mint. And when it overgrows and you pull the car in right over the mint, you step out of the car, you feel like you're in the garden. If you leave it alone, it doesn't give forth its fragrance. So here she is saying, she is telling the wind, inviting the wind to come blow upon my garden in order that the spices flow out. And now she invites him, let my beloved come to his garden and eat his sweet fruit, which we assume is an invitation for intimacy. So in other words, we're still at the wedding, or the wedding scene, or still everything is still wonderful. Now we turn the page, we go to chapter 5, And chapter 5 is a beautiful verse. It's in the Chabad literature. It's very significant, as we will discuss, hopefully. And now he is talking. She invited him. She invited him. Yavai Daidi, maybe my beloved should come to the garden. And what was the language? I forgot already. My beloved should come and eat his sweet fruit. And now he is talking. He says, that's what I did. Bati Lagani, I have come to my garden, my sister, my bride. I have gathered my mirth with my spice. I have eaten my sugar cane with my sugar. I have drunk my wine with my milk. Eat, friends, drink, ye drink abundantly, beloved ones. And this seems like a beautiful, beautiful scene. He's at the wedding. She invited him. He says, I came to my garden, which is probably a metaphor for intimacy. I took in the smell of the fragrance. I ate the sugar cane with my sugar, drunk my wine. In other words, all the senses are being fed. And not only is he happy, but what do you do at your wedding? You also invite your friends to come and rejoice. And that's what he says. Eat, friends, drink abundantly, beloved ones, and everything is amazing. Now, according to the most readings, the problem, verse 2, is a very big problem. In other words, not the verse 2 per se, but the break to put verse 1 in the same chapter as verse 2 is strange, because as we will speak next time, verse 2, there's already a distance. She is asleep. He is out of the house. He's trying to get in. She's not letting him in. And that's the story unfolds. I sleep, but my heart is awake. Hark, my beloved is knocking. Open for me, my sister, my beloved, my dove, my perfect one. We'll get to this later. The bottom line is, verse 2, there's a crisis. So most people would say that, at least according to the Jewish reading, the song ends. The third song really ends right over here between verse 1 and verse 2. And that is most readings. Of course, there's one reading that says it a little bit different. Hopefully we'll get to that as well. Okay, so what are we talking about? We first have to begin so that's the conventional reading. They're at the wedding, they're rejoicing. She invites him to her garden. He says, I've come to my garden. Amazing. I took in the spices. I ate the sweet sugar cane, drank my wine, milk, everything. It's amazing. I also want to share with my friends. So this would be the highlight of the song according to this reading. And in some sense, it seems to be the peak, right? You can't get a better moment of unity, of intimacy. And from here, the crisis develops, and we'll have to deal with the crisis when it comes. But right now, everything is perfect. Okay, so that's the conventional reading. And now we want to shift to think about how the commentators on Medrash and Rashi are going to read this, and how are they going to explain the historical context. And maybe we'll do a little of the Hasidic reading, because Hasidic reading here is a little abstract, but we'll try. We'll make an effort. But we begin with Rashi. So let's look at Rashi. Let's open him up over here. Again, any comments or questions, please jump in. And we'll see what we make of Rashi. So Rashi, again, according to Rashi, the wedding has two parts. We discussed this in the past. A wedding in those days has two parts. Today's day, we make them both together. There's the kiddushin, the betrothal, where the man gives the woman the ring, but that does not consummate the wedding. She's considered married, and she can't marry anybody else at that point, but they can't live together until they have what they call nisuyin, marriage, which would mean coming together under the chuppah, under the canopy. And today's day and age, for various reasons, we do both ceremonies together, but it used to be done separately, up to a year apart. So it seems that Rashi, when we spoke about the verse at the end of chapter 3, the day of his nuptials, the day of his marriage, and the day of the rejoicing of the heart, Rashi says there's a moment. What's the wedding between God and the Jewish people? The wedding was Sinai. Sinai was the kiddushin, was the betrothal. And then that's not complete yet. It's only sort of the first step. And then when do we move in together? When are we in the same home? That, we said, is the building of the Mishkan, the building of the tabernacle. And like other commentaries in the Medrash say, ultimately that's the building of the temple in Jerusalem, not just the miniature temple. But Rashi focuses on when the Jewish people build a home for God in the desert, and God dwells in that home. Now we're at the marriage. Now we're in the same home. That's the second step of marriage, going under the canopy. It just happens to be that it's not exactly clear when the second, even the way we do it today, what is the real chuppah? What's the real nisuyin? What's the real marriage? So if you ever played close attention to a Jewish wedding, you'll see that there's the chuppah. During the chuppah, like I said, there's the two stages of kiddushin and nisuyin, betrothal and marriage, which has two separate blessings. It's really the first one, betrothal, has one blessing, and then the nisuyin, the marriage, has 7 blessings, but it's 2 separate stages. But then afterward, we know there has to be witnesses for a wedding, for a kosher wedding. So what happens is the bride and groom have to go to a room and be secluded for a certain period of time, and the witnesses have to make sure that they're secluded in that room. And according to some opinions, that really is the concludes the marriage. In other words, you have to come into a home together. Some people say the chuppah is already enough; it's symbolic home, but others say you actually have to be in the same room together, secluded, and that is what makes the marriage happen. So if you're going to say we built a home and God enters, and we enter the temple or the Mishkan, the portable temple, is the place where the marriage happens. So if that's the marriage, and now Rashi wants to interpret all these expressions of spices and eating wonderful food and fat and eating wine and milk, and everybody eating and drinking. Rashi wants to say this is at the wedding festival. In other words, it's associated with the temple. So let's read Rashi. I have come to my garden. This is the groom speaking. This is God speaking. I came to the garden in the days of the dedication of the temple. I have gathered, right? What do they say? I have gathered my mirth. I have gathered. So Rashi first gets into the Hebrew. The word ariti is not a common word. So Rashi deals with that. And it is in Mishnaic language. In other words, the biblical Hebrew and the Hebrew of the Mishnah is a little bit different. Rashi says that this word, so later, remember, this is the Ketuvim, this is the end of the writing. So you're not going to find this word in the beginning, in the early writings of the Hebrew Bible, but you will find it in the Mishnah. In the Mishnah, you see as much space as is required by a picker, oreh, and his baskets. It is also in biblical language, and all the wayfarers have plucked its fruit, aruha. That's in Psalms. In other words, Rashi is bringing biblical sources to the idea that the word aruha, the word ariti, means I have gathered. Okay. This was stated in regard to the incense. For the princes burned private incense on the outside altar, and it was accepted. This is something that does not apply to later generations. And because of this, it is stated, I have eaten my sugar cane and my sugar. There is honey that grows in canes, as it is stated, into the sugar canes, Ya'arat Hadvash. And Ya'arat is a term referring to canes or reeds, as it is stated. And she placed it on the reeds, Basuf, which Unkel's render is Vishibuta Beyara, and the sugar is sucked out and the wood is discarded. But I, out of great love, ate my Ya'ar with my honey. I ate the cane with the sugar, the inedible with the edible, signifying the free will incense. And likewise, the he-goat sin offering that the prince had sacrificed, although his sin offering is not sacrificed as a free will offering, but I accepted them on that day. So this is very, very interesting. What's happening here is Rashi is saying as follows. If you read this description of the wedding, it's interesting. It sounds, when I read it the first time, it sounds like everything is fine. They're eating all the good food. But Rashi says, 1 second. Nobody eats the sugar cane with the sugar, right? The sugar cane, you people would suck on the sugar cane and throw out the actual cane. Just suck the sugar. And that's one point. So what does this refer to? So Rashi says, if you look at the day when the Jewish people inaugurated the temple, the leaders of the tribes, it's in the Bible, it's in the book of Numbers, chapter the second parsha, the portion of Naso, and there you read that. And there you read that when the temple was inaugurated, the people, the leaders of the tribes, offered offerings to God. Now, those offerings were not the regular conventional offerings, because usually, for example, let's talk about the incense. The incense was offered inside the temple, In other words, inside the temple had a courtyard and had an inner chamber and that was inner chamber, and then even deeper chamber, the Holy of Holies. Usually the incense was offered in the inner chamber, not the innermost, but the inner. They call it the holy, inside the tabernacle. On that day, the leaders of the tribes who offered their offerings, they brought many offerings that were not prescribed in the Torah, including incense. Now, those incense was not brought into the holy, to the inner chamber, because that on the inner chamber, on the inner altar, was called Mizbeach HaZahav, the altar of gold. The inner altar, we don't offer anything there that was not prescribed in the Torah. So instead, what they did was they took the incense and offered it in the outer altar, which is in the courtyard. In addition to that, they also offered sin offerings. And sin offering is something you don't offer on a voluntary basis. You only offer if it's prescribed in the Torah. So Rashi is saying here, it's a wonderful wedding. But at this wedding, because everybody was so excited, you go to the wedding, you eat too much. That ever happened to you? Happens to me, certainly I ate too much desserts. So here, the groom is saying, it was so exciting. I ate everything. I ate the honey, but not just the honey, but also the stick, the cane, not just the sugar, but also the sugar cane. And in that sense, it's alluding to, because God was so happy, he accepted the offerings, even though on a regular occasion, prescribing those offerings would not be the best thing. Offering those offerings would not be good, because it was not the order. It wasn't the offerings that the Torah prescribes. So that's Rashi. Now we continue. I have drunk my wine. Where do you see that? The groom is drinking the wine. So these are the libations. In the altar, when they would offer the offering on the altar, they would also pour wine. That's my wine. And my milk, they were sweeter and clearer than milk. Okay. Eat, friends, in the tent of meeting. These are Aaron and his sons, and in the everlasting temple, all the priests. In other words, in the temple, God is saying to his friends, come, let's all make a party, let's eat. Who eats the sacrificial offerings? Who eats in the temple? Who eats at the wedding? It's Aaron and his sons. They were the priests. But they were the priests in the temple, in the portable temple, in the temple of the desert. It was only Aaron and his sons. But later, what Rashi here calls the everlasting temple, which is the temple in Jerusalem, it was all the priests participated in the party, eating the sacrificial offerings. Drink abundantly, beloved ones. These are the Israelites who ate the flesh of the peace offerings that they offered up for the dedication of the altar. In other words, there were certain parts of the offering that were eaten by everybody, not just the priests. So there's friends and beloved ones. So Rashi says the friends are the priests, the beloved ones are the rest of the Israelites. So again, we're at the scene. The temple is happening. It's amazing. Everybody's excited. Everybody's eating, and everybody is drinking. So this is Rashi's interpretation of this verse. Before we get to the Hasidic and the Kabbalistic, I want to give one more interpretation that is a little bit different and may help understand the transition to the crisis in the next verse. But I'm just going to share it. But then we go back to the Midrashic interpretation, which is much closer to Rashi. But in the meantime, if anyone has any comments or questions, please share. Otherwise, we continue to the second interpretation based on the historic reading. So let's see if I can pull this up. It's not in the English, so I'm opening up a different page here. Okay. The second interpretation that we're going to read is from the Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra was a great poet and commentator on the Torah, and he sometimes sticks to pshat, to the simple meaning, in a way that diverges from the traditional medrash and the traditional sages, which is fine. He reads this verse a little bit different. He reads this verse not as everything is wonderful by the wedding. If everything is wonderful by the wedding, why is there a crisis in the next verse? So what the Ibn Ezra reads is that within this wedding scene, there's subtle rebuke, so to speak. In other words, there's some problem. What's the problem? So let's read what he says. So I'm going to share the screen just because so I can see it, but it's just the Hebrew here. So we'll read the Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra says, very short, but what he says, something profound. The Shekhinah says, the divine presence says, the husband says, the man says, Bati Lagani. This is very different than what the Medrash says. So I'm just giving you another option. I returned to my place above after I received the pouring of the wine and the showbread and the first fruits, and Israel was rejoicing and eating the offerings. And this is similar to the verse in Isaiah, Lama li rev zivchechem, why do I need all your sacrifices? I've been satisfied. In other words, I'm full. I'm satisfied of the olot, the elevation offerings, and the rams. In other words, quoting the verse from Isaiah, the verse from Isaiah is the rebuke where the prophets tell the Jewish people, God doesn't want your offerings. Meaning to say that the offerings were supposed to be a way to bring the people close to Hashem. But at some point, the offerings become the ritual that the Jewish people do externally, but it doesn't represent the inner transformation. So at some point, the prophet starts saying, God doesn't want the offerings if you offer it this way. And what the Ibn Ezra is alluding to is it could be that going back originally to the original wedding scene, which is the temple, certainly the Temple of Solomon, because we know, I'm looking for the commentary, I saw it last night, I can't find it right here. We know that what happened in Solomon's temple wasn't always, wasn't so exciting, wasn't always positive. I have to find this commentary. But when Solomon built his temple, what happens was, there's a terrible description in the verse, I'm speaking from memory, which is a terrible thing to do, but there's a terrible description in the book of Kings that after Solomon builds the temple, and after Solomon creates this whole celebration to God, then he goes to his wife, the daughter of Pharaoh, who is a very problematic scene, and he makes a festival with her. In other words, and that's totally negative. In other words, because the Torah says he shouldn't go back to Egypt, and his marriage to the daughter of Pharaoh was to tighten his, in other words, to create a close bond with the Egyptian kingdom. So in other words, in the time of the temple, even the temple that Solomon built, immediately after the great celebration of the temple, Solomon is already going and celebrating with his wives, who many of them were idol worshipers and did not convert properly, and the negativity is already right after the during the wedding scene, during the temple, there is already the seeds for the sin that's going to develop later, for the separation that's going to develop later. So that's why the Ibn Ezra would tell you that this is not, as we have read till now, the way Rashi reads and the way the Medrash reads and the way the Hasidic commentary read it, which is God coming to the garden, God coming to the wedding. It's the opposite. It's God saying, I'm going away from this wedding because I don't like what I see. I don't like what I see. I see that people are making a great party, but the party is a distraction. And if you think about this, if you think about coming to the wedding and the bride and the groom are sitting there and everybody is partying, everyone's inviting to party. What happens if the bride sees, if the groom sees that the bride is losing, is not focusing on the groom, but instead is thinking about the party, right? So in that sense, that's the beginning of the separation that we're going to see in the next verse. So that is the second way of reading. And if you read it this way, then it would make sense to place verse 2, to place verse 1 in the same chapter as verse 2, because verse 2 is the separation and verse 1 is already the seeds for the separation. And the commentary I saw last night, which I don't remember who he was, that mentioned the daughter of Pharaoh, also mentions that's why the idea of taking the cane, the sugar with the cane. And he says, I'm not a great botanist, but he says the same thing is if you look at the spices that were mentioned in the verse, I have gathered my mirth with my spice. So it seems like this is talking about, just like he ate the cane with the sugar with the cane, he ate the mirth with more doesn't have to be the best smell. And he ate it together with the spice, represents the person just grabbing everything and not discerning, and it's not necessarily a positive event. And Rashi himself addresses the notion that it's a strange thing that by the temple they offered offerings that were not prescribed and that without theoretically would be problematic in another setting. It's just that because of God's great love for the people, God accepted it. So this is the two ways of reading it. Either way you can read it. Either you can read it that we're talking about the wedding and everything is perfect, and everything is fine, and this is the culmination of the unity. That's the traditional way of reading it. And then there's a later way of reading it, which is already at the wedding scene, there's already the seeds of the problem that we're going to confront later. So before we get to the Hasidic, I want to go to the Medrash a little bit. And this is a very important Medrash in the Chabad literature, as I will explain. But any comments in the meantime? Vic, it looked like someone may have a comment. Okay, we'll continue.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. How does it connect to the previous verse? Because here, if you only read this verse, if I come to my garden, there is a problem because you cannot eat the sugar cane with the sugar without creating a problem. And the same for the mirth, right? But the previous verse in chapter 4 was about his garden also. How does it connect to that?
The previous verse is she's inviting him. She's inviting him to the party. And he comes to the party. So the people. So if you read it you read it the rabbinic way, it's no problem. It's wonderful. If you read it the way that it's a little bit critical, and you say you're not supposed to eat it, at a wedding you can get away with things that are not normal, right? You could eat a little bit more dessert at a wedding because the love is so profound. This nishkefarlach, like you say in Yiddish, is not terrible. So that's Rashi's reading. Rashi's reading is, yeah, at times of great joy, you don't have to be so predictable and just follow exactly the offerings prescribed in the Torah. You could take the liberty. You can bring your own incense. And that's a beautiful expression of the being spontaneous in a relationship, which is very good, according to the convention. That's according to the rabbinic reading. The Ibn Ezra says, one second, there's a problem here. Don't eat. Why are you eating the sugar canes? In other words, you're not thinking logically, and the husband sees that this is that the woman is distracted, and that's why he reads it the opposite. I'm going back to my place. This is not a place for me, because already at the wedding party there's already the seeds of the separation.
Yeah, that part I understood, but the last verse in chapter 4.
Yeah, chapter 4 seems to be. I have not seen. Let me see if the Ibn Ezra reads that in a negative way. I don't know. Let's see if the Ibn Ezra reads that in a negative way. Let's find the Ibn Ezra here.
So he's already in his garden, right? He's not at the wedding according to this interpretation.
Yeah, he says the opposite. The Ibn Ezra is reading that. Ibn Ezra is reading that. the previous verse is also negative.
Right, because I think it keeps accumulating. Verse 16 you're talking about, right?
Yes, verse 16, the previous verse. Evan Ezra is reading that verse that the wind comes and blows around the garden. Let me share the screen so everybody can see it. Evan Ezra is reading verse 16. Awake, O north wind, and come, O south wind, blow upon my garden, that the spices thereof may flow out. You can read this as I read it, as the wind will come and make the spices more fragrant. Or you can read sort of a storm coming in and blowing all the spices around and destroying the garden. And therefore, it says, as a result of the wind coming and throwing the spices onto the floor and ruining, imagine you set up a whole garden, you set up spices on the table, and the wind comes and throws everything on the floor. He reads, the Evan Ezra reads, let my beloved come to his garden and eat his sweet fruit, means God is saying, I'm going back to my garden. I'm checking out of here. So,
Right.
that's the Ibn Ezra. So good observation. But again, so if you're going to read it negative, you have to read it negative earlier as well. But again, but we're not going to go back to the conventional interpretation, to the interpretation of the Medrash, and Rashi quotes the Medrash basically that this is all positive, and this is the culmination of the unity between God and the Jewish people, because it's the wedding, and it's when they built the Mishkan, they built the temple. God dwells in the temple. Now you have the wedding. Now you have the chuppah. Now you have the canopy, and now everyone's together. Beautiful. Now we're going to quote a Medrash here that is a interesting Medrash, and I'm just going to quote it. I'm just going to read it. I'm going to open up the Hebrew so we see the Medrash. So at least I know. Okay, here we go. The Medrash this is Medrash Rabbah. Says the Medrash, Bati Lagani, I've come to my garden. Amar Rabbi Menachem. Rabbi Menachem, the son-in-law of Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Avuna, says in the name of Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rabbi Yosena. It doesn't say I've come to a garden. You know, you go to the wedding, you say, where's the wedding? The wedding is in a garden. It doesn't say I've come to a garden. What does it say? I've come to my garden, ligani, to my garden. And then he says, ligani, garden. Garden represents ginuni. Ginuni is an Aramaic word for pleasure. It's a place of my pleasure. So the Medrash so far is making 2 points. Number one, God says, I'm coming to my garden. In other words, the groom comes to the wedding and he says, I'm back at my garden. And what is a garden? A garden is a place for pleasure. Says the Medrash, what does this mean? I'm coming to the place where my essence was in the beginning. I'm coming back to my garden because I used to be here, because my essence was here in this garden. And the Medrash continues, because the essence of the Shekhinah, of the divine presence, was in the lower plane, in the lowest place, down here on this earth. How do we know? Because he quotes the verse that in the Garden of Eden, the essence of God was in the Garden of Eden. Then the Medrash continues. Adam sinned. The Shekhinah, the divine presence, went up to one level of heaven. According to the Talmud, there's 7 levels of heaven. And then came the second sin, the sin of Cain, and the Shekhinah went up to the second heaven. Enosh came, went to the third, etc., until ultimately, in the days of Abraham, because of the wickedness of the people of that period, the Shekhinah was in the 7th heaven, the most distant from earth. In other words, we're starting a scene where God creates the world. He has the Garden of Eden. He's present in the Garden of Eden, but then the human sins push God higher and higher away from being present and being manifest and being revealed in this world. Then the Medrash continues. Then there were 7 righteous people who begin to bring the divine presence down back to earth. Abraham from the 7th heaven to the 6th, Yitzchak from the 6th to the 5th, etc., until you get Moses. And Moshe brings the divine presence back on earth. And where does that happen? The culmination of that is in the building of the temple. Just a second. In the building of the temple. So what this Medrash is saying is very interesting. When God comes to the temple, dwells on this earth, when the temple is built, when the Torah is given, when the temple is built, there's 2 ways to look at it. One way to look at it is when God comes to this earth, he's really coming to an unnatural place. When God comes into the physical realm, when we do a mitzvah and we bring God into the physical earth. One way to think about it is God is coming to an unnatural place. And it takes difficulty and work to bring God to this world. Says the Medrash that no, that's not the reading. With one word, one letter really, the Medrash changes that interpretation, because the Medrash points out that the verse doesn't say God says, wonderful, I came to a garden. I used to be in heaven. I used to be in spiritual matters. And then when the Torah was given, I came and met the Jewish people on this earth, which is not my natural habitat, because God is in heaven. God's in spiritual matters. It's very hard to sense God in the physical realm without the Torah and the mitzvot. So the Medrash says, no, but that's a misreading of the scenario. What the verse says, I've come to my garden. I come to the place where I used to be. My essence used to be here. In other words, when God creates the world, initially the natural state of the world is not evil. The natural state of the earth is a place that is hospitable to the essence of God. It's just that the world becomes corrupt. And the seven sins push the divine presence higher and higher away from God being felt in this earth. But ultimately, when the wedding happens, and the Jewish people through Sinai, God comes down to the world and gives us the way, the roadmap of how to bring him into this world. And then when the Jewish people build the home for God, and God finally does come back, because we create space for God in the physical world by using physical objects to serve God. At that point, it's not that this is unnatural. Now we're reverting back to the natural space. God says, now I'm once again comfortable in the garden, in the place that I used to be here. And the Medrash adds one more point, which is the place of my pleasure. Because of course, why does God create the world? A place of imperfection. Because ultimately, that's what leads him pleasure. You get pleasure from the unexpected. You get pleasure from the unnatural. So if in heaven God's presence is felt, if God has a home in heaven, that's not pleasurable. Pleasurable is when God can be felt in an unlikely place, which is the physical earth, right? People now, I think I just read that they're having the first time we have civilians going to space. 4 people are going to space. One is a billionaire, one's a school teacher. I already forgot all 4. People want to go to space. Why do they want to go to space? It's not for scientific exploration. No, because they want to be in a place. There's a certain thrill in being in a place which is unnatural. In other words, that's a chidush, that's a novelty. People pay a lot of money for that. And that's ultimately what God gets pleasure from. But we're not creating that space. God created the ability for him to be felt in this world. He was felt in this world in the beginning of creation, in the unnatural space. People, the human beings, corruption pushed God away. But when we bring God back, based on the wedding, which is the Torah, and the building of the tabernacle, which is a physical manifestation, but we also have the equivalent of that in our life. When we create this temple for God in our life, the figurative temple, then God comes back, but he's not coming back to a new place. He's coming back to a place where he always was. And this is a very positive view on the world, that it's not that the world is terrible and bad and evil and we have to transform it. It's that the world essentially is positive and good. It has been corrupted to a degree, and it's up to us to recreate, to bring God back into the garden. Why is this so important for Hasidic literature? For Hasidic Chabad culture? Because the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, the 6th Chabad Rebbe, passed away in 1950. And on the Shabbat that he passed away, so he passed away on Shabbat. He didn't know he was going to pass away. Maybe he did, but no one knew he was going to pass away. But for certain occasions, he would publish a Hasidic discourse. And he published a Hasidic discourse for the day that turned out to be the day of his passing. And the opening phrase of the Hasidic discourse is, as every Hasidic discourse has an opening phrase, is this verse, Bati Legani, I've come to my garden, my sister, my bride. And he quotes this Medrash. And he explains it for 20 chapters. And then he passes away that Shabbat when that discourse was published for. A year later, when our Rebbe accepted leadership, so what he did, the first discourse he ever said, which in the Hasidic culture, when you say a Hasidic discourse, it's sort of accepting of the mantle of leadership or the yoke of leadership. When he accepted the yoke of leadership, the first discourse he said was an elaboration on his father-in-law's discourse, quoting this Medrash that I just read to you. And he said, we are, if you look at Chabad lineage, we're the 7th generation. And just like the Medrash says, the 7th generation of the people who bring back God back into this earth It's the job of our generation to bring Mashiach, to bring the divine presence back onto this earth, to bring God back to his garden. And that was sort of the mission statement of the Rebbe's life. And we continue that mission statement. And for every year, he used to give an elaboration on that discourse on the day of the passing of the anniversary of the passing of his father-in-law. So Bati Lagani, we have 40 discourses from the Rebbe, beginning with this verse, Bati Lagani, have come to my garden. All are basically saying elaboration on that point of how we have to bring God back into this world. And when we do, it's essentially just uncovering the deeper truth that was not always naked, revealed to the naked eye, but always existed, that this place is essentially, this world essentially is a garden for God. So the wedding that happened historically, and ultimately we're going to see that if in the conventional reading, in the simple meaning, layer 1 and layer 2. Layer 1 is the simple meaning that there's a bride and groom that fell in love and found each other after many obstacles and had a wedding. Layer 2 is historically the Jewish people and God create this wedding together at Sinai and at the temple. And later on, you will see that from next week, from next verse, there's already, the honeymoon is over. And now there's distance. And now there's terrible pain. And therefore, historically, there was separation between God and the Jewish people. But when you read the Medrash and you read the Hasidic interpretation and you read it on the third level, which is our personal relationship with God, then Bati Lagani, I've come to my garden, is a standalone verse. And every time we connect to God, we're bringing God into his garden. What is his garden? This physical earth. And that's really, we didn't get into the discourse of Rabbi Shneur Zalman on this, but Rabbi Shneur Zalman talks about this, how we have to bring God into our life. He gets into this whole thing. Kabbalistically, the first half of the night is more concealment. The second half of the night, which traditionally people would wake up at midnight and then start studying Torah. And that is how we bring God back into this world. But in any case, without getting into the intricate details of what are the angels and what is the honey, what's the honeycomb, we can get into that. Maybe we'll get into next week, or maybe we'll go straight to the next verse. But the bottom line is we are empowered to bring God back to his garden. And we do that by when we create the wedding between God and the Jewish people by bringing God into our life with the figurative temple. And every time we bring God into our life, we're creating a temple for him in our own hearts. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short. Unfortunately, it's a busy day, a lot to do. I got to run. But we have 4 or 5 minutes for questions. So any questions or comments, please share. Otherwise, have a wonderful day. And we will meet next week, God willing, hopefully in the Sukkah. The only thing is I'm a little bit nervous to read the sort of the negative parts in the Sukkah. But don't worry, the Hasidic spin always puts positive onto the negative. So a few minutes longer next week, but we're also going to have to read the positive interpretation. So this is the story in short. Thank you all for joining. We have a few minutes for any comments. Otherwise, have a wonderful Shabbat. And remember, it's the season of our joy. All the serious things we accomplish on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and we sort of get back in touch with our essential connection with God. Now is the party. Now we celebrate that bond with God, and prepare now for the celebration. And both is the actual celebration. So good times of joy, and the joy should last for the entire year in good health.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
You too.
Thank you.
You know, you talk about the Hasidim having their luck. It was supposed to rain this whole weekend. And
Right.
we were worried about the rain and sitting, because we were in, I don't even know where we were. At this time, we were in Jersey.
Yes.
And we were in a tent, and we're worried it's going to rain. What should we wear? My shoes, my this, my that. Never rained, not a drop.
Amazing.
It is.
Now we just have to hope it doesn't rain in the sukkah, because the Hasidim sit in the rain, even in the sukkah, even in the rain. Most Jews, when it rains, they follow the law, which is you go back inside. But the Hasidim don't want to leave the sukkah, so the Hasidim sit in the sukkah even in the rain. So hopefully it won't rain on the nights of sukkahs either.
Can you put something on top of the shchach?
Well, most people do, but we don't, because we're going to sit in the sukkah even in the rain. And if you put a covering, then it's like sitting in your house. You may as well sit in the house.
So along that concept, so you're not supposed to wear a raincoat or a hat.
Raincoat is different. The raincoat is different because the raincoat is your garment, or your garment is part of you.
Oh,
Right?
I
It's just like saying I'm wearing my kippah, right? So I'm still under the sukkah because the garment is still part of me.
So a waterproof hat?
Umbrella, you don't sit with an umbrella. An umbrella is
No.
not a garment. So an umbrella in the sukkah would be like sitting in the house, which is fine. You could sit in the house, but if you're going to sit in the house, you may as well sit in the house, not sit in the rain with an umbrella in the sukkah. That would be
Yeah.
And look like a normal person.
right. Well, sitting in the sukkah in the rain is not too normal either, but that's another story. But we just said at a wedding, we do strange things. You know, people dance. You don't always dance. A normal person, you're walking down the street, you're not going to dance. But at a wedding, people juggle. People do all kinds of strange things at a wedding. If the joy is intense, you could do things that are not that logical. You can get away with it.
Well, we'll find out in a couple of days what it is.
Okay.
Be well.
Have a good Shabbos.
Have a good
Yeah.
Shabbos
Be well,
and
everybody. Thank you.
regards.
Good
Thank you.
job.
Thank you.